Deep blizzard wind tore the rope from Aiyana's frozen hands at 31 below zero, the night that would change everything. Tobias thought he knew about the widow. He'd almost turned away. She looped the rope back around her own waist and went out into the white anyway, because up in the barn rafters, the last air vent had frozen shut solid, and inside that barn, 29 cattle and a newborn calf were breathing air that would not hold out much longer. 10 weeks earlier, 3 different ranchers had turned her away at their gates. A widow, alone, with 2 children, and a busted cartwheel, not fit, every one of them decided, for work that belonged to a man. That had been the first week of October on the road into Antelope Flat, Colorado territory, dust rising behind a handcart pulling crooked on its bad wheel. Aiyana walked it herself, both children riding on the blanket stacked inside. Nora, 8 years old, sitting straight back the way her mother had raised her to sit, and 4-year-old Eli holding his father's dented tin cup against his chest like it was the last warm thing left in the world. They had slept 2 nights under the wagon and eaten the last of the flour that morning. 3 ranches in 2 days had turned them back at the gate. Nobody wanted a woman who couldn't mend fence or break a horse. Nobody looked past that to see what she actually was. At the last bend, before the land opened into empty grass, a board hung crooked from a fence post. Cook wanted it read, Stone Hollow Ranch. Beyond it sat a low log house, a hay shed leaning hard to one side, and a barn door slamming itself open and shut in the wind like it had given up being latched years ago. No smoke rose from the chimney. It rolled instead, low and thick, spilling down across the shingles and pooling in the yard. Aiyana stood at the gate and studied that smoke longer than she studied the sign itself. Before she'd taken 3 steps toward the door, she already understood the place needed a great deal more than someone to cook its meals. She tightened her grip on the cart handle and pulled it through the gate anyway. The door opened on the 3rd knock. Tobias stood in the frame, 64 years old, still tall though his shoulders had started to fold forward the way a man's does after decades of hard winters. A strip of wool wound around his left knee. His right hand hung slightly curled, a hand that had not opened all the way in, longer than he cared to explain to strangers. His eyes went from Aiyana to the 2 children behind her to the cart. Can you cook? Aiyana met his eyes without flinching. I can bake sourdough that doesn't go flat, soften meat too tough to chew, keep beans from splitting in the pot, and stretch one meal into 3 days, and my children stay with me. He started to shut the door. A gust caught it, and smoke rolled out of the kitchen and down the hallway behind him, and he coughed hard into his fist. Aiyana looked past him at the thin line of daylight showing under the kitchen door, and the soot staining the ceiling above it. His face tightened half-accusation. You're studying my house. A long silence stretched between them, like the next words cost him something to give up. I need a cook. Your children need a home. He laid out his terms plainly. 3 meals a day, run of the kitchen, the pantry, and the milk room. No wages until spring, food and shelter in the meantime, a small room off the kitchen for her and the children, and she was not to change how the ranch ran without his say-so. Aiyana glanced once more at the chimney. I'll cook for you. But that stove of yours is pushing smoke back into your own house. I've lived with it 16 years. Smoke doesn't care how long a man's put up with it. He set the spare room key on the table without another word. She didn't reach for it right away. Nora watched the key sitting there. Then Eli coughed, a small, dry sound, and only then did Aiyana pick it up. The kitchen held a long table, 4 chairs, and 3 tin bowls hanging on pegs, one worn smooth from years of use, the other 2 dulled under a film of dust. She washed all 3 and found a deep mug for Eli besides. The pantry gave away the rest of the story before Tobias had to. A sack of flour had drawn damp, potatoes were sprouting eyes in the dark, salt pork hung too close to a wet wall. 2 jars of beans sat under lids that had never sealed right, and the sourdough starter in its crock had gone thin and weak from the kitchen turning too cold overnight. Tobias watched her rearrange his shelves without asking permission. "What are you doing?" "Left the way it was. Your food runs out by November. Stored the way it should be, it carries you to January." That first night, working around a stove that still fought her every time the wind changed, she served beef stew thickened with dried onions and a skillet bread that came out golden despite everything against it. Tobias finished one bowl and reached for a second. The meat was a touch too tender, he allowed, which from him was as close to praise as the room was going to get that evening. Nora waited until her mother lifted her own spoon before she touched hers. Eli fell asleep against Tobias's coat by the stove, where the warmth lasted longest, and Tobias reached to pull the coat back, then stopped himself and let the boy keep it. Later, clearing the table, Aiyana noticed an old wooden ladle hanging alone near the hearth, set apart from the other tools. She lifted it to look closer. Tobias went very still. She set it back exactly where it had hung. That was Eleanor's. Aiyana only nodded. She never pressed to learn who Eleanor had been, not that night, and not for a long while after. She was up before 5 the next morning to relight the stove, and the instant she cracked the kitchen door, the west wind drove smoke straight back into the room instead of letting it climb. A candle flame she lit, to test the draft, leaned hard toward the doorway and nearly guttered out near an old air inlet behind the stove. Every time the outside door opened, more smoke rolled in. She climbed a ladder onto the low roof to see for herself the chimney stopped short of the ridgeline. Soot had narrowed the flue down to almost nothing, and the metal cap sat bent sideways, catching the west wind and forcing it straight down the stack instead of letting smoke rise past it. Tobias's voice carried up from the yard sharp with irritation about the roof. "Nobody cooks well," she hollered down, "in a kitchen that smokes out its own cook." Reuben Cole, the local blacksmith and freight hauler, rolled in with a load of salt that same morning, and Aiyana had him help her raise the chimney another 3 feet 7 inches using scrap tin and iron bands. Reuben laughed out loud at the idea of it. A cook, measuring a chimney. Once it was up, she opened the lower air inlet behind the stove, too wide on her first try, and the fire roared through an entire armload of wood in under an hour. Tobias only pointed out, mildly enough, that she'd traded smoke for waste. She didn't argue the point. She fitted a sliding wooden cover to close off part of the opening, testing it against the candle flame until the flame showed her the truth before anyone else did. That evening the smoke rose straight and clean, and the same armload of wood lasted nearly twice as long. Reuben studied the chimney a long moment before climbing back into his wagon, and allowed that the stove had finally learned which way it was supposed to breathe. When Tobias stepped into the kitchen after dark, he didn't cough once. He set another split log down beside her without a word, and walked back out. 3 days on, Marsh Colton rode over from his own spread to the east, more than 300 acres he'd built up over the years, and more than once he'd tried to buy Stone Hollow off Tobias for less than it was worth. His eyes went from the taller chimney to the new inlet, and finally landed on Aiyana, who was kneading a mixture of clay, river sand, wood ash, and chopped horsehair against the outside of the cabin wall. "Since when does a cook go around repairing houses? Since the house stopped making me cough every morning," Tobias put in, before she needed to answer for herself. Marsh poked at her mixture with the toe of his boot. Looked like chicken coop mud to him, in his opinion. She let the remark pass without a glance. She tied a short length of thread beside a gap in the wall and watched the wind snap it sideways. Then packed the gap with fresh mixture and hung the thread again. This time it barely moved. A piece of string won't save a ranch. No. But it tells the truth about where the warmth is leaking out. He turned back to Tobias before he left. A widow with 2 children wouldn't be so quick to leave once the snow was deep, he warned. Their agreement ran till spring was all Tobias gave him in return, Flat and final. Aiyana kept quiet, watching him go. That night, her small travel bag still sat beside the bedroom door, packed and ready. Should I keep my boots where I can find them fast? Nora wondered, looking at it. Aiyana tucked another blanket over Eli. Not yet. Over the following 2 days, she worked her way around the whole cabin, packing every gap low along the walls, and the first batch of mixture spread easily and sat fast, and by evening the rooms already held their warmth longer. Then the temperature dropped to 19 degrees overnight, and morning showed long cracks running through the fresh work, whole sections pulled loose where the timber had shrunk in the cold. Marsh happened to ride past again just then and couldn't help pointing out that the wind had made its own case plainly enough. How much time did we just lose? Tobias's jaw was tight, watching the cracks. Aiyana pulled every cracked section off the wall, laid the broken pieces on the workbench, and cracked one clean in half to look at the inside. Too much clay, not enough give. The logs had kept moving, and the mixture hadn't moved with them. She mixed a second batch with less clay, more sand, more ash, and a heavier handful of horsehair, and this time she packed it deep from the outside before smoothing the inside face. Nora trailed behind her, marking each finished section with a stub of charcoal. 3 nights later, the temperature fell again to 16 degrees, and this time the repaired joints held whole. Aiyana ran her thumbnail along every seam. Instead of taking the win for granted, a repair only earned her trust after it had survived a second cold night. That same afternoon, unprompted, Tobias hitched the wagon and came back with 2 fresh loads of river sand. Checking the livestock feed a few days later, Aiyana stopped halfway into the hay barn. The air smelled sweet in a way that wasn't right. Not fresh hay, but the beginning of mold. The top layers were still dry, but the bottom bales sat straight on damp ground, water leaking in along the north edge of the roof, wind sneaking through the west wall and pulling loose strands off the stack without ever drying out the soaked base underneath. That hay has to carry 22 cows and 7 calves through to March, Tobias reminded her, one hand resting on the nearest bale. Aiyana ran the numbers in her head. Leave the wet bales where they sat, and the mold would spread. The stack would heat up from the inside, and he'd lose more than hay before winter was out. She made that much plain. Her plan came in 6 parts. Raise the whole stack 7 inches on cottonwood. Runners pull every damp bale apart from the dry ones. Cut a low vent on the dry side. Hang oiled canvas across the worst of the draft, and patch the leaking roof with cedar boards and pine pitch. Throwing hay away didn't make more of it, Tobias grumbled. She cut one wet bale open instead of arguing, and handed him the gray rotting center to smell for himself. He gave up the argument after that. For 2 days they worked the barn together, Nora hauling wooden shims, Eli gathering short lengths of rope, Tobias driving nails one-handed because his right hand still wouldn't close around a hammer. When the new stack finally stood clear of the ground, Aiyana left a narrow gap of air underneath it. Why not seal it up warm? Hay doesn't need warm, it needs to stay dry. 2 days later, a mix of rain and wet snow moved through, soaking the barn's dirt floor, and the spoiled bale left down on bare ground soaked the moisture straight up, while the raised stack stayed bone dry. Tobias looked at the two side by side without a word. That evening he broke the last of the fresh bread in half, and gave Nora the bigger piece. Not that hungry tonight was all the explanation he gave. If stories about quiet strength earning its place at a table are the ones you love, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. You'll get these full frontier sagas early. Near the end of September, Nora noticed a small door at the end of the hallway she'd never seen opened. Is that room cold in there? Doesn't need to be warm. Nobody's living in it. That night the temperature dropped fast, and while Aiyana was checking the seals along the north wall, she felt cold air being pulled in from under that locked door, stealing warmth out of the rest of the house. She kept it to herself that night. She only tied a short thread near the gap at the bottom of the door and watched it stretch straight through, pulled by the draft. The next morning Tobias came to her with a key in his palm. The room had been Eleanor's. Inside stood a sewing table, a box of needles and thread, an unfinished child's coat folded over a chair, a hand-drawn map of Stone Hollow pinned to the wall, 3 winter journals gone soft with handling, and a small chair under a film of dust. Tobias stood in the doorway a long moment before speaking, quiet in a way. Aiyana hadn't heard from him yet. She wrote everything down, he managed finally. Memory doesn't hold a temperature. Aiyana opened the journals and found the first freeze of every year recorded, the worst wind directions logged, weekly firewood counts, and a page describing a barn that had once rained inside itself after every vent had been sealed shut. The last page held a single line, moving air, steel still, air keeps. Aiyana closed the journal without treating it like scripture. Old knowledge only mattered if the land still agreed with it. That was a lesson older than any journal, one her own grandmother had taught her long before Stone Hollow, watching wind bend grass and reading what it meant to come. Nora lifted the small sewing box, then set it back down, uncertain, and Tobias picked it up himself and set it gently in front of her without a word. Then turned to the window while Nora hunted through it for dark thread to mend one of his worn work gloves. By the first week of October, a thin skin of ice had begun forming in the water bucket before sunrise. Aiyana traced the problem to the livestock trough, where a skim of ice formed across the surface every single morning. The supply line ran only 19 inches under the ground, and one stretch passed close along the north wall, where a ring of white frost had formed around the pipe where it entered the house. Every winter I break the ice with an axe, Tobias put in. Like the habit itself was proof enough. The trough's not the real trouble. A hard enough freeze could stop the whole line dead. Her plan meant burying the exposed stretch 4 feet 6 inches deep, giving the pipe a fall of 1 inch for every 10 feet so water would drain back toward the cistern on its own, wrapping the wall section in dry wool inside a wooden box, and building a floating cover for part of the trough. Reuben spent the afternoon digging while Marsh rode past, calling out that she was burying labor instead of saving any. The first cover she built was solid pine board, and by the next morning a calf had pushed against it, and nothing had moved. Nora crouched beside it, tried to lift one edge, and frowned. It's heavier than Eli. Aiyana laughed under her breath and built a second cover out of hollow cottonwood slats instead. 2 nights later, only the narrow open strip of water had frozen it all, and the calf nudged the lighter cover aside with its nose easily. That evening Tobias waved Nora over to the chalkboard hung beside the kitchen door and handed her the chalk. Right down to day's numbers, he let her know, plain and businesslike. It was the first job he'd ever handed her that belonged to the running of the ranch itself, not just the running of the household. The cattle barn came next. Its main door faced straight into the northwest wind, which could drive snow across the troughs and the bedding in a bad storm. Low gaps along the floor let cold air sweep through, but the narrow openings up under the roofline were what carried the damp air back out. Tobias wanted every opening on the place sealed tight. Years back he'd lost 2 calves to a hard cold snap, and tighter had always felt safer to him ever since that winter. Aiyana built an angled windbreak just inside the entrance out of old boards and woven willow, turning the worst of the draft before it ever reached the cattle. She sealed the low gaps, but left the upper vents open on purpose. After she went back to the house, Tobias quietly stuffed old rags into those same vents himself, believing he was finishing the job properly. That night the barn felt warmer. By morning it smelled wrong, water beating under the rafters, the bedding damp through, 2 cows already coughing. As the first light hit the roof, droplets started falling like rain inside the barn itself. Aiyana looked at the stuffed rags and held her tongue for the moment. She opened Eleanor's journal instead, to a page marked years earlier. Barn rained inside, too tight. She pulled every rag free. Built slanted baffles under the vents to keep snow out while still letting the damp air escape, and spread fresh bedding through the stalls. Caleb Reyes stopped by that same morning to check on Tobias's knee, and he paused at the sound of the coughing cattle, mentioning that damp air breaks down lungs faster than cold ever does on its own. Within 2 days, the moisture had cleared and the coughing eased. Tobias stood by the open vent a long moment. "I blocked it," he allowed finally, the words plainly costing him something. "Thank you for saying so. Now we'll open it back up." He looked out toward the barn. "What do we fix next?" It was the first time since she'd arrived that he'd wanted her opinion instead of giving an order. And from that day on, whenever he brought up work outside the kitchen, he stopped calling her the cook. He used her name. By the first week of October, Aiyana had noticed the northwest wind picking up strength morning after morning, thin snow and dry leaves gathering in the same diagonal line across the yard every time. The cattle always turned their backs to it. Even with the chimney fixed, smoke still leaned sideways whenever the gusts hit hardest. She spread Eleanor's hand-drawn map across the kitchen table and laid it beside the old snowdrift notes in the journals. The wind had already drawn them the map, she pointed out, tracing the line with one finger. She planned an L-shaped windbreak, 7 feet 2 inches high, set 26 feet off the barn, running 41 feet along its longest side, built from pine posts, woven willow and rope, left loose and full of small gaps on purpose rather than solid. Tobias raised the posts. Nora measured every distance with a length of rope knotted every 3 feet. Eli hauled short willow branches back and forth all afternoon. Racing to finish before dark, Aiyana wove the section nearest the hay shed too tight. That night the wind hit the barrier, curled downward instead of past it, and piled a drift of snow straight across the hay shed door. Marsh rode by the next morning and couldn't resist pointing out that her fence looked like it was inviting winter right into the yard. She studied the drift and had to admit privately that he wasn't wrong. She pulled out nearly a quarter of the willow, widened the gaps and lowered the far end so the wind had somewhere to go instead of crashing back down. The next hard blow made a different case. Snow streamed clean across open ground east of the barn, and the door stayed clear. So the first one was wrong, Nora wondered, looking up at her. The first one was. Now we know how to build the second one right. The land had corrected the design. All Aiyana had done was listen to it. In the middle of October, Tobias had his first family visitor in nearly 2 years. Alias Ward, the nephew who had long assumed Stone Hollow would come to him one day, rode in on a well-fed bay horse, wearing a town coat that had never once seen a branding fire. His eyes moved over every change on the place, the taller chimney, the charcoal marks along the wall, the windbreak standing in the yard, the raised hay floor, children's clothes drying behind the kitchen. Then his eyes settled on Aiyana. And who's this the cook? Was all Tobias gave him. Elias glanced at the table where 4 bowls now stood instead of 3. Since when did a cook dig water lines, open Eleanor's old room, and rebuild the man's barn for him? He wanted to know. Aiyana kept slicing turnips and never looked up. Elias reminded his uncle that Stone Hollow was meant to come to him, that if the widow stayed through the winter, people would start saying he'd already signed the place over to her. Then came the offer, laid out smooth as a card trick. Move into town, let Elias take care of him, sell the ranch to Marsh Colton, and be done with it. Tobias understood exactly what his nephew was really after. It was the land Elias wanted, never the old man attached to it. No, the word ended the conversation entirely. Riding off, Elias left one more line hanging in the cold air behind him. A spoken agreement was worth nothing once winter set in, or if a man didn't happen to wake up one morning. After the dust settled, Aiyana folded a kitchen towel slowly. "I can leave before the snow gets deep. There won't be trouble over it." Tobias looked at her hard. And where would you take 2 children in the middle of winter? She had no answer for that. That night, Nora set her boots quietly beside Eli's, right next to the travel bag by the door. Tobias saw it. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Elias's threat didn't fade with the sound of his horse. Tobias knew his nephew's nature too well to let it go, and he understood that a spoken promise would mean nothing at all if he didn't wake up one morning to keep it. He wasn't about to let anyone's greed push Aiyana and her children back out into the cold. Before the sun was even fully up the next day, he'd already sent word into town. That was why Reuben Cole came riding back the following morning with Dr. Reyes and Hollis Vane, the part-time notary out of Antelope Flat, none of it something Aiyana had been warned to expect. Tobias handed Hollis a short, plainly written document. It gave Aiyana and her children the right to stay at Stone Hollow through the winter, no matter what, safe from anyone forcing them out into the snow. If Tobias died before spring, the paper read, she would run the cattle, the hay, and the house herself until the estate was settled, and any wages still owed her would come out of the spring calf crop. Has she pressed you for any of your land? Hollis wanted a plain answer before he'd put his name to it. No. Promised to look after you and trade for it. She proposed leaving on her own, Doctor. Reyes nodded slowly, calling it as sound a piece of judgment as he'd ever witnessed. Only then was Aiyana brought in to read it, sounding out a few of the unfamiliar words before she signed her name at the bottom. This doesn't say I own a thing. It's not a will. It's only a promise that nobody puts children out in the snow if something happens to me. She signed without asking anything further. She never thanked him for it out loud. That night the travel bag still sat by the bedroom door, but Nora's boots and Eli's had gone back under the bed where they belonged. Sometime past midnight, Nora woke for a moment and saw her mother quietly untying the rope wrapped around that bag. For the first time since they'd walked through the gate, it no longer looked ready to leave at a moment's notice. By the last week of October, every sign arrived at once. Cranes flew south earlier than they should have. Ice as thick as a coin's edge formed in the water bucket before dawn. Jackrabbits had already turned white early. The cattle gathered by the windbreak before dusk without being driven there. Smoke hung low across a clear sky instead of rising away. Dr. Reyes's barometer had been falling steadily for 2 straight days. Aiyana laid every sign against Eleanor's winter journals and found the same pattern recorded 19 years earlier, right before a hard November blizzard had hit the valley. She began a final walk of the whole place. Every haystack, every drain, every trough cover, every rope holding the windbreak up, moving the weaker cattle in closer to the inner wall, and stretching a guide rope from the house door straight to the barn, with lanterns and tools staged at both ends. Marsh shook his head at all of it, calling it foolishness over a few birds and a frozen bucket. Nobody knows the weather for certain. One sign line to you is one thing. 6, pointing the same way, isn't something you ignore. Tobias looked out across the yard. Forget the south fence for now, he decided out loud. They'd get ready for winter instead, starting that hour. Before he left the kitchen that evening, he pressed Eleanor's old wooden ladle into Aiyana's hands, letting her know, low, that she'd want 3 days of food, laid by at the very least. The first real cold hit in early November. For 2 nights running, the temperature dropped to 6 degrees above zero, and Aiyana and Nora wrote it all down together. 5 armloads of firewood used instead of 7. 44 degrees in the kitchen before dawn, open water still moving under the trough cover, no frost ring on the wall pipe, dry hay. The 2 coughing cows showed no sign of getting any worse. Marsh showed up after a pipe froze solid on his own place, insisting she was simply lower on the land than he was. Nothing more to it. She made her case by showing him the motionless thread on the north wall, the dry bedding, the water still flowing, and 3 days of careful numbers chalked on the kitchen board. This isn't winter, Marsh finally allowed. No, it isn't yet. She didn't need to say anything more than that. That evening, Tobias took the travel bag down from beside her bedroom door, hung it on a wall hook instead, and filled it with his own work gloves. Aiyana noticed. She left it exactly where he'd put it, before the storm's worst hits. If you want more of these hard-won frontier families, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It truly helps us keep telling stories like hers. On November the 21st, the barometer dropped hard and fast. The wind swung around from west to northwest, and the temperature fell more than 20 degrees inside 6 hours. Snow started before dawn, and by noon the storm owned the whole valley. Wind climbed past 40 miles an hour, and the road to Antelope Flat disappeared under drifting snow before midday. The windbreak shuddered under the force of it, but held. Snow streaming east exactly where Aiyana had built it to go, the barn doors still open. She stretched the guide rope from the house all the way to the barn and gave Nora 4 jobs to hold down inside. Keep Eli close by the stove, write down every inspection time, watch the candle by the north wall for any change, and strike the iron pan 3 times if the smoke shifted direction or the flame went out. Nora nodded once, and Aiyana knew she understood every word of it without needing to hear it twice. Tobias pulled on his coat. "You stay here. My knee hurts. It still walks." Together they gripped the guide rope and fought their way across the yard, through the whiteout to the barn. Inside, Brindle, the oldest cow on the place, had gone into labor weeks earlier than she should have. Then another sound cut through the wind. Cowbells, faint and broken up by the gusts. Drifting over from Marsh Colton spread to the east. Aiyana knew one stretch of his fence stood broadside to the northwest wind, and if it went down, his herd could be driven straight into the deep drifts beyond it. Tobias listened to the bells a moment, then shook his head. They couldn't leave Stone Hollow right now, not with things standing the way they were. No. Her voice stayed steady against the noise of the storm. If this place fails, we can't help anybody else either way. We secure this barn first. Back in the house, Nora wrapped one hand around her end of the guide rope and watched the candle flame, the one thin thread still connecting her mother to home. That first night of the storm, the temperature fell to 18 below, and the wind climbed toward 55 miles an hour. Inside the barn, Brindle labored hard while 29 animals filled the cold air with warm breath. Aiyana looked up toward the upper vent and saw it. Wet snow had packed solid against the outside baffle, the opening nearly gone. Airflow slowed to nothing. Drops of water had already begun forming under the rafters. Quote, "She knew exactly what would happen next. Seal that vent by accident, and the barn would feel warmer for a while, right up until the moisture built and the bedding soaked through, and the newborn calf lost heat it couldn't afford to lose." Tobias reached for his coat. All go clear it. His bad knee buckled under him before he even made it to the barn door. Aiyana untied her end of the guide rope and wrapped it twice around her own waist instead. Hold the lie. 2 pulls haul me back in. 3 pulls feed me more rope. She dropped to her knees. The second she stepped outside, the wind hitting her like a fist. She crawled hand over hand along the wall until she found the buried baffle, and inside the doorway Tobias wound the rope twice around a support post and leaned back against it with everything his bad leg could still give him. Outside, a short shovel hacked again and again at the frozen snow until the packed ice finally broke away all at once, and a long stream of warm, damp air burst up out of the opening and rose into the storm in a white cloud. Within minutes, the air inside the barn cleared. The land had proven her right. Following the guide rope back, Aiyana stumbled over something dark, half buried beside the windbreak. Not a fallen log, a man. It was Marsh Colton, barely conscious, half swallowed by drifted snow. The windbreak had stopped him before the storm could carry him any farther into the open. She grabbed his coat without a moment's hesitation and dragged him along the rope straight for the house instead of back to the barn. By the time he reached the door, he was shaking hard with cold. His shoulders slipped from its socket, his lips gone pale. My east fence is down, herds scattered. 2 of my hands are still out there somewhere. She got him settled near the stove to warm through, then gathered hot water and fresh towels fast, because Brindle couldn't wait much longer either way. The guide rope yanked hard just then, Tobias signaling from the barn. Aiyana looked at Nora, then down at 4-year-old Eli, and knew she couldn't carry everything on her own and couldn't leave the children alone in the house with a half-conscious stranger during a blizzard either. Coats on. All of us are going to the barn. Marsh forced himself up onto his feet, favoring his good arm. Wanting to come along, he could hold a lantern, at least even one-handed. Bundled in every warm layer the house had, the 4 of them clung to the guide rope and inched their way through the blinding white until they reached the barn together. Inside, Tobias braced Brindle's head against his own shoulder, while Aiyana reached in carefully, remembering everything Dr. Reyes had once shown her about a calf turned wrong in the womb. One front leg was folded back beneath it. "Hold her!" Steady the wind pounded the walls outside, and nobody wasted a single word inside. Nora set down the hot water and towels, and kept Eli well clear of the drafty door. Marsh sat on an overturned bucket, his hurt arm hanging useless, and held the lantern up as high as he could manage with the other. Slowly, patiently, Aiyana worked the trapped leg forward, one careful pull, and then another, nearly an hour passing before the calf finally slid free onto the straw. It didn't breathe. She cleared its nose with dry straw, rubbed hard at its chest, lifted its hindquarters to help the last of the fluid drain away. Nora rushed forward with a warmed wool blanket. For one long second, nothing happened at all. Then the calf coughed. Its small chest rose. A thin breath escaped into the freezing air of the barn. Nobody in that barn made a sound. Outside, faint voices carried through the storm. Help! And the lantern burning steady in the cabin window was their answer back. Following that single light, Marsh's 2 ranch hands made it to Stone Hollow before midnight. By the time the storm reached its worst, 5 grown adults, 2 children, 29 head of cattle, and 1 newborn calf all stood safe inside the system Aiyana had spent 2 months building. Outside, the thermometer read 31 below zero. Inside the calf pen, the air held above 28 degrees. In the kitchen, it stayed at 44 just before dawn. The chimney drew clean. The trough still carried open water under its floating cover. The hay stayed dry straight through. Not a single drop fell inside that barn roof. The windbreak kept the doors clear the whole night. Every repair had depended on every other one. Not one of them would have held alone. Together, all of it held. Eli quietly wrapped Tobias's old coat around the newborn calf, and Tobias watched him do it, the same way he'd watched him fall asleep under that coat their first night together, and he never once reached to take it back. 3 days later, the wind finally let go of the valley. Antelope Flat woke under a blanket of white. At Stone Hollow, the windbreak leaned a few inches but still stood upright. The barn doors opened without needing to be shoveled clear. The hay was dry all the way through. Water still moved beneath the floating trough covers. Marsh Colton's place showed a very different story. 1 whole fence line vanished under drifts, 2 troughs frozen solid, part of the hay shed roof torn clean off and rain soaking in behind it, 3 cows still missing and 2 more found dead, where the wind had driven them into a snow-filled draw. Marsh rode over to Stone Hollow without a word to say for a long while. Reuben Cole stood nearby. So did Dr. Reyes. A handful of neighboring hands had gathered to see for themselves what had actually made it through the night. For a long moment, Marsh just studied the barn, the windbreak, the chimney, drawing a clean line of smoke into the cold, clear morning sky. I thought she was just patching up a dying ranch. He looked toward Aiyana across the yard. Turns out she was the reason it was still breathing. Nobody had anything to add to that. Dr. Blick. Reyes opened his notebook instead. No pneumonia, no livestock loss that couldn't be accounted for, the storm calf alive and steady, water still running, feed still dry. Those were the only numbers he cared to write down that morning. Later that same afternoon, Elias Ward wrote in, once the road had finally cleared, a folded purchase agreement tucked inside his coat. He never got the chance to unfold it. Tobias walked him through the whole ranch instead, past the raised hay floor, past the buried water line, past the windbreak standing firm, past the kitchen where the stove burned clean without filling the house with smoke anymore. Then he stopped walking. What exactly did you do for Stone Hollow during that storm? Elias looked out across the yard and found nothing worth saying. To that, Tobias let the silence sit a moment before he filled it himself. Land didn't belong to the man standing around waiting for its owner to die. The words came quiet, but they came clean. It belonged to whoever kept it, able to feed the living. He rested one hand flat against the weathered barn door and left it there. By then, Aiyana had already gone back out to the barn because the newborn calf needed fresh straw laid down. She never heard the last of that conversation, and it was fitting that she didn't. She hadn't rebuilt Stone Hollow to win any argument. She'd rebuilt it so it could survive one more winter, and then another after that. In January, Tobias sent word asking Hollis Vane to come back out to Stone Hollow one more time. The winter agreement was set aside and replaced with a new will entirely. If Tobias died, half of Stone Hollow would pass to Aiyana outright. The other half would belong equally to Nora and Eli, once they came of age. If Aiyana ever chose to sell any part of it, she would wait until both children were old enough to have a say in the decision themselves. Elias would receive his uncle's gold pocket watch and a modest sum of money, not 1 acre of land. Tobias never showed Aiyana the full document that day. Instead, he handed her the long-term management agreement and settled her first wages plainly. 5 spring calves, hers to keep outright. She stared down at the paper. That's too much. I hired you to cook. He looked out the kitchen window toward the barn. You kept the water running, kept the hay dry, kept the smoke rising the right way instead of the wrong one, kept the cattle alive through a storm that should have killed half of them. I'm still paying you less than I owe you, and we both know it. Nothing more needed saying after that. That evening, 4 bowls sat around the kitchen table, and not one of them hung empty on the wall anymore. Tobias took in the warmth of the room, a long moment. Eleanor, he remembered out loud, not quite to anyone in particular, had always believed a house stayed alive when the people living in it knew how to keep the heat without keeping the smoke. Nora smiled and handed him his mended work gloves, stitched sturdy enough for another winter's use. Eli looked over at the young calf, sleeping in fresh straw by the stove. Will our calf sleep outside when it's spring? Our calf. Nobody in that kitchen corrected him. 3 years passed at Stone Hollow. 2 smaller barns went up alongside the first one. The old windbreak had grown into a living line of willow trees strong enough to stand on its own against any wind the valley could throw at it. Nora filled page after page of Eleanor's old journals with new weather notes and lessons she'd learned firsthand, her handwriting steadier every season. Eli raised the storm calf into one of the strongest cows on the whole ranch, and he never stopped calling her ours, and by then nobody bothered correcting him, because it had simply become true, plain as the willow trees themselves. Nobody quite remembered the exact day the travel bag disappeared from beside the bedroom door for good. Whenever a storm crossed the prairie, now a lantern still burned steady in that same window, a sign to anyone watching that the hay was dry, the water was running, and the people inside understood something. Most folks never learn in a whole lifetime of ranching that surviving a winter was never the work of one repair, but of an entire system built to hold together through whatever came. Aiyana had not been handed a home at Stone Hollow. She had built one, board by board and season by season, reading wind and heat and moisture the way her own people had taught her to read the world long before she ever saw Colorado. until Winter itself had no choice left but to admit she'd earned the right to keep it standing.